Our water connection acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land throughout Australia and their connection to country, sky, water, and community. We extend our respect to the traditional custodians of the place where you are listening. This episode is recorded in Ghana country and Ngunnawal country. What does it take to make water accessible, equitable, and resilient across the globe? What role does Australia play in solving water challenges beyond its borders? In this episode, we will explore Australia's role in international water for development. My name is Jez Bordicus. I'm on a mission to increase your water curiosity, and this is A Water Connection. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Michael Wilson. Michael has a 25-year experience and career in international development, water resource management, and governance. He's currently the CEO of eWater Group, providing creative, science-based, and trusted water management expertise and tools to meet both Australian and international needs. Michael has led 8 programs in Southeast Asia, advanced gender equality initiatives, and advised on sustainable development policies. With experience as well in the private sector and global development, his path has been shaped by adaptability and a commitment to positive impact and a willingness to embrace opportunities. We're very excited to have Michael today with us. Welcome to A Water Connection, Michael.
Thank you very much.
I mentioned a little bit in the intro to talking about making water accessible and equitable and resilient across the globe. So let us start with that. How is this mighty mission and very big mission related to what we know as sustainable development goals?
Well, in both the Sustainable Development Goals that we're currently obliged to align our international assistance against, and the Millennium Development Goals, which came before, agreed in 2000 and applying until 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals succeeded them. The goals pertaining to access to safe and clean water and sanitation have been consistently lagging across the globe. They've been, in other words, some of the goals and targets which have been hardest to address and hardest to achieve over the history of the MDGs and the SDGs. So looking at why that is and what some of the binding constraints are is a really important way to chart the pathway to do things differently in the future. It's not that progress hasn't been made in the past. It's just that when you have intractable problems, intractable development constraints, you really need to look very hard and look inwards and outwards at why certain goals are proving particularly challenging to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's very interesting kind of introduction to that millennial goals and then the sustainable development goals. And I guess we want clean water for everyone, but it wouldn't be an initiative of an individual country working towards their own business because we know water is global. So could you lead that into explaining a bit of what are we talking about when we say international water for development? What is that cooperation we're talking about?
So really that is the idea that any expertise aimed at addressing a development constraint or a development challenge should be seen as global, that there's likely to be people and organizations across the globe that have parts of the puzzle to add to the eventual answer. And the whole ethos of the practice of international development, regardless of sector, whether we're talking about basic education, whether we're talking about extreme poverty, whether we're talking about food production, whether we're talking about gender equality, is based on a supposition that without international cooperation, it's going to be very much harder for countries facing development barriers to overcome them on their own. So it's not just about resources, not just about money. Sometimes the focus of the international debate is all around the dollars, but it's about expertise. It's about the ability to share internationally through discussion, two-way, multi-way discussions of what has worked and what hasn't worked in a variety of different contexts. And so it's no different with water. And it doesn't really matter whether a country facing water resource management challenges is a country that's faces desertification or one that has high rainfall. It's that's not necessarily relevant. But if a country like that has access to international expertise and more importantly the ability to discuss and brainstorm its challenges with a range of people with experience in solving water challenges, they're more likely to come up with sustainable solutions. And Australia doesn't pretend to be a leader in every area of international development, but one area where we do have very well recognised expertise internationally is around water management. And the biggest reason for us having that reputation, is firstly that we have been over decades willing to share our knowledge freely. But secondly, we have experience managing a very scarce resource in the driest inhabited continent on Earth. And if you're good at managing water in a water scarce environment, you'll tend to be good at managing water in almost any environment. And that has explained why Australia's expertise has been sought out over many decades in the international development story. And it doesn't mean that Australia's way of doing things is the answer to every situation. It's about the way Australians have been able to work through a problem-solving approach for many different sorts of water challenges that we face on our own continent. And that provides a sort of analytical way of doing business, which we think is useful in almost any context.
Yeah, no, that actually covers even my next question, which was about like what is the part that Australia plays, and I think our in water scarcity management and probably management of very inter-boundary basins such as the Darling Basin is something that I've known that is kind of sought after that expertise on it, but it's a very important like thing or point that you point across that it's a matter of like getting the expertise in, and why do we have to duplicate maybe resources and efforts into finding solutions for certain problems. So that's certainly quite interesting. How does that interaction work? Like, is that done between the governments, or does that happen? How does one country ask for help with a particular water challenge? How does that work?
Well, there are a range of ways actually, but very commonly it is between governments. So you will have a government in a developing country reach out to Australia, describing a water challenge that it has, and being aware of Australia's record in managing difficult water challenges, initiates a conversation. Now, sometimes Australia's failures are actually more valuable than our successes. So when we tread the international stage talking about water for development, we're not treading that stage saying that we're the best and that we have all of the answers. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We take a view that we've had some significant failures in history which still impede our ability to move forward on water sustainability in our own nation. But that humility and that preparedness to talk about some of the mistakes we've made, some of the barriers that we have faced in the past, and some of the barriers that remain tend to make us a trusted partner. So, you think in any sort of human relationship, you're more likely to form a relationship of trust with somebody who demonstrates some humility and vulnerability about their own experience. And that's where I think Australia's interaction on the international stage in the water for development debate has been unusual and particularly effective for us, because we start, I think, by listening. We don't start by talking about ourselves. We don't start by offering solutions without very much understanding of the local context. We start by asking the question, well, what do you think your water challenges are, and in what way do you think we might be able to help? And that's a pretty fruitful way to start a discussion in any sort of complex field.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it is very interesting to know how that conversation starts. And like once a conversation starts between governments, I was curious, what is the role that eWater group has, for example, in this particular ecosystem of problems all over the world or in different parts of the world or of the region and Australia having that expertise to help in some of these things? What is the role of eWater group there?
So there are a couple of angles to that. One is a very direct one, and that is that eWater runs on behalf of the Australian government, funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, a number of water resource management program initiatives funded by the Australian Aid Program in developing countries overseas. The flagship program that we run for DFAT is called the Australian Water Partnership. And the Australian Water Partnership functions by engaging in developing country contexts, understanding the water management challenges through discussion with partners. And that can be government, but it can also be through research institutions. It can even be through alumni of students who've studied in Australia in these fields in the past. So there are any number of angles where this sort of conversation can start. Once we've framed up and have agreement with the partner on what we think the problem looks like, we then move into a sort of diagnosis and response phase. But it's important that that's co-designed too with the developing country partner. And then what the Australian Water Partnership does is essentially bring together the range of Australian expertise that might be required in treating that problem, providing some response, if not a complete solution, at least some response to the central elements of the problem, and doing that in a properly designed and sequenced and budgeted way. The other way that eWater engages at the international level is actually through some of our tools and some of our people who understand how to operate those tools in contexts, including in developing country contexts, which might be quite different to Australia's. So, for instance, we at eWater are custodians for something called eWater Source, which is a technology-based platform, a software platform, developed over nearly 30 years now as a collaboration between research institutions and governments. And eWater Source is Australia's national hydrological modelling platform. So it allows decision makers, those tasked with making judgments about how our scarce water resources can be best and most fairly deployed to effectively manage the water coming down our river systems. So not only volume, but water quality, looking at water use for different sorts of users and consumers, And increasingly, we are needing to add capability to eWater Source to model future climate change scenarios and their effects on the availability of water resources and the reliability of access of Australian water resources into the model. Now, eWater Source is also used internationally, so it is a very powerful tool which is built on a great volume of data, mostly data which is open access across the world, but including deploying computing power now that was not even available or conceivable 5 years ago. eWater Source has been adopted as the hydrological modelling platform, for instance, for the Mekong River Commission. So a body tasked by countries in the Mekong region to advise and provide reliable data and decision support for water managers across Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand in particular. Cambodia has also adopted eWater Source as its national platform, and Source is being used in a number of other modeling contexts across the globe. So that allows us to test whether Source is equally reliable and dependable in very different environments to Australia's
Yeah.
own. And as we compile that experience, it allows us to have ever greater confidence in the accuracy of the predictions that the tool can make, but it also allows us to continue to add data to the databases upon which it draws to provide the information for water decision makers. So in those range of areas, our engagement internationally in the water resource management discussion and the water for development effort is very important to eWater's future and survival. And we very much hope and think that we add value internationally with the partners that we continue to work with. Some that we've been working with for decades, some much more recently.
Yeah, of course. So it sounds, yeah, very clearly kind of what are the two sides of eWater Group that are contributing to this international water for development. And it sounds like you guys have in-house a lot of expertise in the resource kind of modeling side of things. Does the projects that the other side, the Australian Water Partnership works, is it only related to that water resource management as well, or you guys help other nations in other types of water challenges that maybe required expertise from other parts of the industry, the local industry or the Australian industry?
So it does depend a little bit. We do focus our activity on water governance is probably the best way to put it. So if you consider the continuum of dependency on water to start at the source of wherever your water supply comes from and finishing at the tap or the toilet or the drainage outfall, we are most strongly working at the upstream end towards where the resource comes from and how we understand its behavior and variability and what impacts on its availability, its quantity, its quality, and its usability. So there are other organizations and other programs that work in what's called the WASH space, water supply and sanitation.
Yep.
And we're often working very closely with those sorts of organizations, but in order to make sure the whole continuum is being considered from source to tap, if you like. So, for instance, in some programming, we work very closely with WaterAid Australia, and WaterAid is a specialist water resource and sanitation and hygiene focused non-government organisation, global non-government organisation, very, very capable in what they do, very, very solid reputation. But the reason we are working together more and more frequently is because an organisation like WaterAid recognises that they can only do good when the water comes into their hands in the first place
That's true.
for distribution, and sometimes the upstream water governance is a limitation on what they can do, and we work with them for if you like the opposite reason. There's no point in us doing what we do at the upstream governance end unless we have the consumer, the user at the end, ultimately in mind, because at the end of the day, they're what matters, and
Yep.
it is the water quality, quantity, and reliability in their hands, which relates to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal number 6.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, and that sounds like a good approach. You try to do and have a focus area, but then if there are other organizations within this ecosystem in the international development, definitely tap in and make partnerships with them. Sounds like the good way to go. Can you share an example of a successful collaboration in this space that maybe that the side of the Australian Water Partnership has been involved?
Yeah, so we've had an interesting and fairly long-standing collaboration in Vietnam, with the Vietnamese government and a number of Australian Water Partnership partners have been involved in delivering this. But Vietnam in one way has a pretty sophisticated capability around water management. That's partly because of the way Vietnam is set up and the jurisdiction between the national government and provincial governments. It's not unlike, I mean, they've had many more provinces than Australia has states, but it's not unlike in some ways our federated system, where decision making around natural resource management on the ground happens at several different levels. But where the water hits the field, if you like, or hits the tap, is very much in the wheelhouse of the provincial government. So while we've been working on water resource management in Vietnam for a long time, around better understanding how the water resources behave and what impacts and variability there might be, we worked out in conversation with the government that there was a weak point in terms of the legislation governing water resource decision making, and that made it unclear to some about who was responsible for making what sorts of decisions. So there was some overlap, there was some duplication, there was some misunderstandings, there was some conflicting decision making happening at certain levels in different parts of government. And we worked very successfully with Vietnam to develop water law, where I'd like to say that Vietnam brought as much thinking and creativity to the table as Australia did. But what we were able to do in terms of deploying Australian expertise was ensure that the right questions were being asked,
Yeah.
ensure that analysis was being done about where the knowledge gaps were, also that knowledge was being deployed to understand where the technical gaps might have been, and also giving high priority to understanding the political dimensions. So, I mean, a little bit about my background. I'm not a water scientist. I'm actually a political scientist,
Yep.
and the reason that I think that skill set fits pretty well when you're talking about water governance is that almost every water challenge is a political challenge as well.
Yep.
particularly when you're talking about transboundary resources, which the Murray-Darling is in Australia, and certainly the Mekong is in mainland
Mhm.
Southeast Asia. But often you find that the technical dimensions are in fact pretty well understood. Where things come undone or fail to move is because of a lack of political consensus, a lack of real mutual understanding about where the interests and incentives lie for positive action on best practice water resource management and improvement and reform. So our experience working in Vietnam has demonstrated a number of dimensions to that problem. It's a really good sort of case study spanning a number of activities that AWP has been involved in to sort of show why a multidimensional approach to thinking about water management is important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's very interesting, yeah, to see how maybe the problem wasn't even that clear at the beginning. It's like, okay, we're having kind of these, but by asking the right questions and by doing that analysis of like who's making which decision, who is responsible, who's accountable for this and that, then Australia is able to kind of support Vietnam in those structural changes that then unlock a lot of the things that can happen after. You mentioned during that your response that like Vietnam, of course, puts a lot of the thinking into this as well as the Australian perspective. I had a question here, like what does Australia learn from like getting in touch with these other nations, and like how can that actually be a learning for us to tackle our own water challenges? What are your learnings from that perspective?
Yeah, so it's very, very interesting. I've spent a lot of time working in Southeast Asia, and I lived and worked in Vietnam for 4 years, and have worked on that part of the world for really the bulk of my career. One of the things that's really interesting, and where I think Australians who have been involved in program delivery in that part of the world have brought back to their work in Australia, because many Australian Water Partnership partners, their core business is Australian water management. When they work overseas, they do it well, partly for altruistic reasons, I think, but partly because they genuinely are interested in bringing that experience back to Australia and seeing how that knowledge can add to our own body of knowledge. And it's what I said before. It's that sense of humility, born by evidence that
Yeah.
in Australia we've stuffed a lot of things up related to the management of water resources. So we have every reason to look for answers elsewhere, as we hope we can provide some advice and answers in other contexts. But what I've seen is that many of these people bring back to their Australian discussion, their discussion about domestic challenges, an understanding about how to operate effectively in very resource constrained environments. So understanding what can actually be done with pretty limited financial resources when the pressure is really on, and bringing some cross-cultural experience back too. So, for instance, many disputes over water management and other issues in Southeast Asia are settled in quite a different way to what we might traditionally have done in Australia.
Yeah.
That sense that consensus is very important, and that to achieve consensus, you've really got to listen very carefully to and attempt to put yourself in the shoes of the other party that you're in dispute with or don't seem to have agreement with, and do that in a polite, respectful way, and take the time that's needed to get to the destination. Sometimes in Australia, I think we have opposing parties brought together to try and resolve a complex or even intractable issue, and a lot of time is spent shouting at each other. You don't see a lot of that. You don't see a lot of that
Yes.
in Southeast Asia. You don't actually see a lot of that in the Pacific either. So I think there's a level of wisdom, a level
Mm.
of understanding about how you arrive at a point of common purpose, even when interests might seem to be quite divergent, and the amount of time that might take. I think a lot of our partners that we have supported to work overseas have brought that back to Australian discussions, and those discussions have become better quality and more productive as a result.
Yeah, that's fantastic because it's good to see that is like in many ways is a two-way knowledge sharing, and like is something where we are learning a lot as well. And honestly, it's really great to know that Australia is in a position of like giving this expertise and give it more visibility to this part of the industry that maybe in the day-to-day of things that happen locally, you lose a bit of visibility of what we can do for other countries as well, and maybe some other partners that could start working with eWater Group and with Australian Watership Partnership as well. So it's certainly quite interesting to learn. This episode is proudly supported by the Chris Davies AM Fellowship, an initiative of the Australian Water Association. His legacy lives on through this fellowship, empowering efforts to keep his passion for innovation and community impact alive. We're honored to have the support of this fellowship this season too, as we continue to share stories that connect us all to water. Now, back to the episode. Just to start wrapping up, you did mention that you're a political scientist instead of like water scientist. So then how would you explain your work to your mate that you know in a barbecue who knows nothing about this sector?
So what I tend to do is say to anyone who may not have thought about the challenges of water resource management very deeply, I'll say, well, in a lot of contexts, it's quite complicated. And where water resources are scarce, it's even more complicated and contested. So what our mission really is to provide decision makers faced with this daunting complexity with at least some reliable information and a basis upon which they can be confident that they are able to make decisions based on the best science and evidence. But then not forgetting that that's not the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That once you have that capability and the confidence in that capability, you're then likely to have to navigate other variables, including the political variables, including power imbalances between different user groups of a water resource, and how you reconcile that, how you analyze and understand who is talking in these conversations, in these negotiations. So, ask yourself, are the needs of every conceivable user group represented in any conversation that is purported to be a decision making conversation and an inclusive conversation? And if there are no women in the room, you ought to ask the question whether
Yep.
discussion is at all inclusive. So that's kind of where that's for me. That's what makes solving these dilemmas particularly interesting, because you can address in many cases the technical aspects. You can address in many cases the knowledge aspects and where the knowledge gaps are, and be very, very explicit and honest about that. But then you get into the territory of contested space where decisions are ultimately political, and the challenge of making those conversations as fair and inclusive and equitable as possible. That's where it gets fascinating, and that's where it gets really, really impactful.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That sounds like a very interesting challenges that you kind of deal with and eWater Group deals with on a daily basis. One of the key audiences that we have are young people that are studying in this industry or maybe are interested in working in something like this. So, what would be your message to young water professionals who might be listening to this conversation?
Look, I think my key message to aspiring water professionals or those who feel that they're reaching forks in the road between careers in water science and water management and others is just to think how fascinating and multidimensional the experience is working in water resource management. Where else can you or do you have to take into account good science, good evidence base, aspirations of a huge range of different stakeholders, political aspects, both big P and little p. So big politics and then local politics down to down to community level, and the challenges of a changing environment driven by climate change. There's going to be no shortage of need for strong, committed water professionals who are interested in a multidisciplinary approach to analysing and solving these increasingly complex problems.
For
How
sure.
exciting. I mean, what else would you want to do?
That's right. And to wrap up, like you mentioned, like that this international development space exists in like many areas, right? And that you have been coming from an angle of a political science background. Why do you work in the water sector?
Because it's complicated. So I think people with my sort of disciplinary background are attracted to complexity. I've worked a bit in how to work effectively in a development sense in fragile and conflict-affected states and parts of the world that have suffered repeating conflict. And I find that fascinating because it's complicated. There are very few precedents. Often the institutions are weak. Often there's not a long history of accepted practice and codes of practice. The reason I find the water resource management space interesting in the same way is because it's really a contest of knowledge. You don't have institutions in the way that you might build a new government from the ground up, but you have certain understandings that are constantly tested, as any scientific hypothesis should be, and sometimes altered on the basis of new evidence, but increasingly altered on the basis that we're experiencing different climatic conditions to that experienced since recorded history, really, or at least recorded written history. There are many First Nations peoples who have knowledge going back millennia and tens of thousands of years about how nature behaves under different circumstances, and we're trying very hard to draw more on those sources of knowledge. But the fact that you are trying to make the best decision possible in the most transparent and defensible way in an environment where the information and data and evidence is continuing to move and be improved upon, but also some of these futures are uncertain. That is a fascinating set of dilemmas to work with him. And if you're fascinated by complexity and by navigating a route through often competing and contradictory drivers to a point where you're making quality decisions which attempt to benefit the majority and which attempt to benefit, in particular, those who perhaps have the least ability to speak up for themselves. That's both incredibly interesting, but also, it's also very rewarding.
Absolutely. It sounds like it. Thank you, Michael, very much for your time today. I think it was amazing to have as I said before, like a bit of that perspective of this part of the water industry, looking beyond our borders, looking at what our own expertise and our own history and our own backgrounds can bring into the table to help other nations with their water challenges. And I think it was really valuable as well to reflect on what are we learning? What are we learning about those conversations and those conflicts where we really need to sit down and listen to the other part and put ourselves in their shoes and take the time that it needs instead of just pushing with our own ideas. So thank you very much for joining us today to Water Connection.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's all for today on the Water Connection. Thank you for listening and being part of our community. Your voice matters to us. By clicking on the send us a text link that you'll find in the description, you can tell us one thing you learned today that maybe I didn't mention. If you have any feedback or ideas of new topics that you would like us to look into, please share them as well there. We would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and social media for updates, highlights, and more ways to connect. Keep that curiosity flowing, and I'll see you next time.